I've talked a lot of cloud tech for accountants in the past 2 years. The most popular app among the people who have used them, Airtable. This is a live session I did, about 45 minutes, diving deep into Airtable, understanding what it will do for you, what it won't do, how it differs from Excel. We did this live in my accountant community. We're releasing it for free. You can even get some continuing ed credits. Check out the links below. And if you haven't used Airtable yet, I'll drop an affiliate sign up link in the video description and you'll float my Airtable bill for a month. So without further ado, Airtable for accountants. Okay, let's get things started. So week 2, thanks everybody for being here. This is gonna be a fun one. Airtable itself is easy. What's harder is thinking and visualizing things in terms of databases. So what we're going to be talking about is how do you structure things as databases, and we're going to learn Airtable along the way because that's the hard part. So if you haven't already, create an Airtable account. It takes 60 seconds if you haven't done that yet. What is your comfort level with Airtable right now? I know some of you have used it, some already. A lot of you haven't used it at all. Cool. A couple people somewhat comfy. Okay. A little motivation. So if you're not familiar with it, GitHub is kind of like the biggest, it's the biggest code repository in the universe. It's where development teams, capital D development teams, manage their code in a way that is shareable, allows them to collaborate around that code. Well, here's a quote from GitHub's CEO. Coding is not the main event anymore. Building software is the main event. Coding is just one small part of it. We think the future of coding is no coding at all. We think autonomous coding is a very real thing. So it's not a question of, are we all going to be able to build software ourselves? It's a question of, what does that mean? How do we help our clients with this? How do we leverage this to make our own lives easier? And to make us successful in kind of the shared goals we have with our clients. So that's exciting. That's the guy with more skin in the code game than virtually anybody else, validating the notion that we're all building software now. And Airtable is kind of like, for me, is kind of tool number 1 for starting that journey. Okay, so this is a slide from last week. A reminder, databases, the backbone of all computer-related things. Everything you use largely on a computer is backed by a database. So it's very important to have a fundamental understanding of how do you store things in a database? How do you think about how you structure objects inside of a database? Once you've got your head around that, the notion of building something yourself is much, much easier to visualize. Airtable is a means to the end for building databases that we can leverage with, third-party tools like Zapier, stuff like that. Best way for this to work is for you to kind of follow along with what I'm doing. If you've got a second display, throw me over on the side and try to track what I'm doing with what you're doing. So first thing we're going to do, you should see a page like this, probably without all of these things. You're in the Bases tab. This is the default view when you pull up Airtable, and we're going to create a base from scratch. So click the little plus and say start from scratch. Give it whatever name you want. Pick a color, but not the slightly lighter color row because those are reserved for pro subscription users, which is just hilarious to me that they give you that option only to swat your hand if you try to pick one of those. And then open up that new base that you just created, and you're going to have kind of the vanilla template for new bases. So Airtable, what you're looking at is a base. The kind of whole space that you're in is called a base, like a database. Inside of that base are tables. You can have any number of tables, not unlike sheets in Excel. It just gives you more kind of dimensions with which you can organize things. And just to kind of talk through the vernacular of a database, your rows are records. So these are instances of a thing. Like if this is your employee roster, each of these records is an employee. And then your columns are your fields. And fields is where you kind of depart from spreadsheet to what is a database and what are the differences between those things. your fields inside of a database are more regimented than something you could do inside of a spreadsheet. So you'll see each of these columns have a little icon next to them. And it's because each column or field has to be a specific type of thing. So I'm going to double click this status one, for example. This is a single select, and a single select is like a drop down. And you can add any number of options to your single select. I'm going to say option 1, option 2, and then I'm going to save. Now this field has, it's an actual drop down with the options that you selected. But that's honestly, that's the main difference between a spreadsheet and an Excel base, is each of these columns are strictly typed or can only be a specific thing like a date or a single select or a bit of text or percent or something like that. That's the primary difference. So Excel spreadsheets are free form. You can willy-nilly color everything, put stuff wherever you want it. And if you're doing something that's more like discovery, more free form, a spreadsheet's going to be better suited for that. But if you're building something that always needs to have a structured format, for example, anything you build an automation over the top of, a database will be better than a spreadsheet. Because if you build a tool over the top of it and it comes looking for a date and what you gave it was a hamburger emoji, your app's going to break. And so that's the value of the structure of a database as opposed to a spreadsheet. So the one thing I'll point out here that's a little different is databases generally have a primary key or a primary field. And that's this first column here. You've kind of got this gray line here. And this is usually used so that you have a unique identifier for a record. So usually this is some sort of unique ID that has to be different for every single record. So that somewhere else, if you want to refer to a specific record in the database, you use that primary key or whatever you want to call it. It can be a little abstract to get your head around what should this be for each use case. So I'll tell you what I normally do. What I usually do is I just call this ID and I set the type to auto number. So what auto number does is it just numbers every record. So if I create more records, it's just going to number 3, 4, 5. And that's a good place to start if you don't really know what should this be right now. This is how I start virtually every base. And sometimes there's a good reason to change it to something else, and I just do that later. But a good place to start there is just auto number each of your records, and then your records have this unique identifier that you may or may not use. So that's Airtable in less than 10 minutes. What I want to do is let's actually like model something that everybody's familiar with, just to kind of think, how would we design a database around a specific object? So let's model a database for bills. Bills are something that everybody understands and is something that we could quickly hack together because bills have like a fixed set of properties. So think about if you use like a bill pay platform, what are all of the components of that bill that you have to enter into the bill pay platform? And start throwing those things in chat. So things like invoice date or vendor name. So I'll make this first one invoice date and set the field type to date. And then you're always going to have some sort of identifier for the vendor. So I'm going to say vendor name and just make that a bit of text. Due date, account code. Sure. Let's say due date. Account code. That is a stretch goal. I don't know if we're going to come back to that or not. I'm going to make that a number that's an integer. There's kind of a lot wrapped up in that one. Yeah, department, class, location, amount. That seems important. Amount. So I'm going to enter an amount one, and I'm going to make the type currency. I'm going to gloss over department, class, location, that sort of thing, because that's straightforward to kind of build upon. I want to keep this simple. Let's say description, or maybe even more generically, this is just notes, like a place to drop any sort of notes about the bill. Now, other things you have to have in order to successfully pay somebody, you got to have your vendor address. I think this would just be a single line text. Vendor city, vendor state, and then zip code. We're just going to say number. So before long, you realize there's a lot of things rolled up in this. And so I'm going to hide this for a minute here. So there's a lot of different components that go into every bill if you look at every single bill in a vacuum. But let's enter a bill. I think I've got a link to just something I grabbed off of Google. Let's actually go through the exercise of entering one, and you can just watch me do this. Because you don't actually enter the vendor address, all of that stuff every single time you enter a record, right? Another thing we left off here is you can actually attach files to Airtable. So we can put the invoice itself in here. So I'm going to say attachment. I don't know, maybe just invoice. So I'm going to pull the invoice itself into this record, and this can be any number of files. Okay, so vendor name, due date, let's just say BGE, due date, June 27th, 14. June 27th, 14. And maybe this is going to be account code 6340, it's utilities or something. Amount 113.68. Okay, maybe I don't have any notes, but you start getting down to like, okay, what about your vendor address, your vendor city, your account number, stuff like that, stuff that they're going to need to actually be able to apply a payment. This is where databases get interesting because, you think about how like a bill.com works or something like that. Your vendors are actually modeled separately from the bills themselves. And this is getting into the kind of relational aspects of databases. So this is a great use case for creating a second table that's called vendors. In general, when you name your tables, a good practice is for this to be kind of what are the things you're putting in here. So if this is an employee roster, your table name would be employees. If it's a list of bills, this table name should simply be bills because each record is a bill. But let's build out this vendor table. So this is where you probably really want your identifying information for vendors to live. And so let's leave this first one as vendor name. And let's just put in a couple super basic things. Let's say street address, single line text, and maybe account number. I'm going to leave that as single line text as well, because sometimes those have wonky formatting with like dashes and stuff like that that aren't really a number. So I'm in a separate table now for vendors. And this is where I can build out a list of everybody that I'm going to pay. And so we'll put BGE in here as an example. BGE 123 Oak Street, and my account number is 1234. Now, rather than building out all of those fields individually, column by column in this bills table, all we're going to have now is a single field that references the other table. So I'm going to right click invoice here and I'm going to insert on the right and call this vendor. And then the type here is going to be link to another record. So I'm going to click link to another record and select the vendors table. So I've selected vendors. Do I want to allow linking to multiple records? Probably not, because you're only really going to have a single vendor, right? But if you think about other applications for relational stuff, maybe this is how you manage, account codes or something like that, or departments. So I'm going to toggle off linking to multiple records. I'm going to hit save. Now, rather than entering all of the details of the vendor every single time I have a bill for this vendor, I'm just going to enter BGE, and it's going to pull that vendor from the other table. So simple as that. So in this table anymore, I don't actually want the vendor name. I'm going to delete the vendor name. I'm going to delete all of the vendor specific stuff. City, state, zip code. This table now is just for bills. And it's going to point to the vendor table to reference a specific vendor. Now, maybe there are helpful things from this other vendor table that would be nice to see in the bills table. For example, let's say each vendor has default payment terms. I'm going to add another column here it says payment terms. And I'm going to make it a single select, add a few options. Let's say net 10, net 20, net 30, net 60. So this is a new field in the vendors table. It's single select type, and I've just put in a few kind of payment term options. Let's say BGE's default is going to be net 30. Now, as I'm entering this bill over here, maybe it's helpful to see what the default payment terms for this vendor are. And that's another field type that you can enter. So I'm going to right click and say insert to the right. And the type is what's called a lookup type field. So I'm going to select lookup. And it's going to ask me what would that be called? What field, I guess, has the reference for what you want to look up. In this case, I'm going to look up what's in the vendor field. So I'm going to say vendor, and then you can pick any of the other fields in that vendor table to display right here. So I'm going to pull the payment terms field. And now that's going to pull through the net 30 from the other table. Now, this is a pretty simple use case, but if you have 10 tables, if you have things happening across different places, this is a great way to pull data in from all sorts of different sources in a kind of helpful summarized view. So that's kind of from a high level, that's relational tables, how you set up one table to reference another. I'm going to show you one more thing in regards to this. I'm going to go back to kind of that Airtable first page we saw, and I'm going to do that by clicking Go Home. I'm actually going to scroll wheel click this so that it opens in a new tab. And we're going to create a second base just to test one thing out here. So I'm back to home. Let's create a second base from scratch. Start from scratch. I'll just call it test base 2. I will use a beer emoji. And I'm going to open that one up. So that's just a new base from scratch like we created the other one. So a really powerful thing that you can do is, and this is kind of a fundamental database concept, is you can have a table that is shared across a bunch of bases. So let's say you were going to manage bills for a few clients out of Airtable. That's probably not a good idea, but stick with me. You don't really need standalone vendor tables for each client. Maybe you do. I haven't thought through this enough to say whether that's a good idea or not. But let's say they shared a lot of the common vendors. Well, you could actually share this vendor table across all of your other bases. And Airtable calls this a synced table or synced base. So I'm back in my first base now, and I'm on the vendors table. I'm going to hit the drop down here. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to hit share view. I'm going to hit share view, create a shareable grid view link, top option here. And I'm going to toggle on allow data in this view to be synced to other bases. Okay, so I've toggled that on now. Now I'm going to hop over to the new base we just made from scratch, and I'm going to create a new table and say create synced table. So I'm going to choose a shared view, and we're going to point it to the shared view that we just made in our other base. So in the base dropdown, I'm going to go find the first one that you created today. For me, that was workshop week 2. And there's a vendor table that's been shared, and it's just the default grid view because we didn't create any other views. I'm going to say next. And actually, each fields sync. If you don't want all the fields, I'm going to leave it as the default to pull in all the vendor data. I'm on a paid plan, so it will automatically sync. On the free plan, you click a button for it to sync, but I'm going to leave all the defaults as they are. So now if this is a new base that I created for a new client that I'm going to do bill pay support for, I can start this base with the entire bank of vendor data that I already have, or 1099s being an example. But there's loads of use cases for that. So let's say you have a common chart of accounts. Maybe something like that makes sense. And then in your bill table, your account codes field is actually a reference to that other chart of accounts table. Well, if you standardize your chart of accounts across your clients, that's something that can be shared across all of your clients. One place where I use this a ton is I have a lot of bases for managing stuff for my team. So bi-monthly check-ins, annual reviews, HR info for people. Each of those bases has a distinct purpose. But fundamentally, they all stem from a common set of records, and that is each of the people on my team. So I have a single base that has all the people on my team. And then the other places where I use that information, they're all pointing back to the same reference for who is my team, so that every time a new person's added, that populates in all those other references, be it a vacation calendar or your annual reviews or something like that. A client list is another great example. So there could be umpteen different things that you do with your clients, whether maybe you manage what services you do for each client here or whatever it is. Your set of clients is common, and you're going to use that list different ways for different use cases. So relational tables are super powerful, something that that I use a lot. And base sync is actually new. It's something that Airtable just rolled out a few weeks ago. Now to update, I didn't show you this. To update the view on the free plan, you just click sync now. And on the paid plans, it syncs every 5 minutes, I think it is. Let's talk about views, and then we'll kind of do a couple of rapid fire base designs. So I'm going to add a couple other bills. So we've got some examples here. So you've got filtering options. Let's say we only wanted to see invoices within a date range or invoices from a specific vendor or group of vendors. That's really easy to filter. Sorting is pretty self-explanatory. A really, really cool thing this does is grouping. And this isn't a great example for grouping because all of these things are, well, I guess we could do this. We could group it by due date. But let's say your client really wanted to see a schedule of what bills were coming up by week. That's a weird kind of thing a client would ask for. That's totally arbitrary. There's a couple of things we could use to build this. And it's one thing I haven't shown you that I wanted to be sure I did show you. It's a field type called formula. So I'm going to create a new field here, formula. And this is Excel formulas is the most obvious comparison here. But if you scroll through these options here, you'll see references to all the fields in your base. And then down here, there's a whole load of functions that you can use. Just like you would have in Excel. This is going to feel familiar. And there's a bunch of help documentation on Airtable's website for this stuff, for each of these kind of formulas. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the formula week num. And I think that's like the number of the week in the year. So if we wanted to group a view of the bills by week in a year, we could have a formula field that is week and then week num. And inside of week num, I'm going to put a reference to the due date. Okay, so that's now giving us a numbered view of what week in the year that bill's coming due. And let's say you had a whole bunch of bills in here. The client wanted to see what week bills were coming due in. I'm going to group by week. So maybe the client wants to see this in a specific way. I'm grouping it by week, so I really don't need the week column anymore. So I'm going to hide fields and I'm going to toggle week off. I'm going to turn that off. Maybe notes is really for me internally too, and I don't want the client to see that. So I'm going to toggle that off as well. And maybe they don't really get to speak into the account code, so I'm not going to show that to them. And they don't really care. They're just thinking about cash flow. So now I've got kind of a concise view that the client can look at. And I can even share, without giving them Airtable access, I can even share this view with them. So I'm going to click Create a Shareable Grid View link. You've got some options here, whether or not you want to allow them to copy data out of the view. If you're on a paid plan, you can even restrict access with a password. And I believe this option will limit it to like, you know, my firm domain. Maybe only people from my firm domain can see it, or from the client's domain can see it. But basically, this is a public link. So obviously be mindful of what this is that you're creating a public link for. You wouldn't want any sort of sensitive info in here. And I'm going to open an incognito window. And now this is what the client can see. So anything you build inside of Airtable, you can create external views for that they can see without creating an Airtable account, which if you're like me, good God, I hate training clients on new tools. Like if I have tool overload, they are already way past tool overload. And so if there's something like this that I can share with them externally, awesome. That's less work for me. So this can be shared, grouped, sorted, filtered, all different ways. That's great. But what about these other view types? So let's just cruise through these down here one by one. So form view. Form view is just, it's a form over the top of that grid view that we just set up. So all the fields that you see here are all of the fields that we just set up. And maybe some of these you want to be included in the form and some of them you don't. So maybe account code we don't actually want included in here. You can drag it over here to exclude it from the field. Maybe notes we don't want included because those are really accountant notes. And we want to require, you know, most of these. So you can toggle required to on. Now you can customize this however you want. Submit a bill. Again, I don't know that you'd actually use this for, you know, bill type stuff, but you can put a big old long explanation in here that's a description of a lot of things, and maybe even a link to a vendor form, so that if it's a new vendor, then maybe they're supposed to hop over to the vendor form, add that vendor, and then that vendor will appear as an option here when they select which vendor the bill came from. So there's a lot of logic you can build into these forms. I don't think that bills is probably a realistic use case here, but you can build out a customized form here, and then you share that form just like you would, you know, the view that we just looked at. So for example, time off requests with my team, that we manage it this way. Gives you a lot of flexibility to build stuff on top of it. Let's go through the rest of the views real quick. Calendar, this might be my favorite one. Let's say that your client wanted to be able to see what invoices were coming due on a calendar. This isn't going to be that useful because I'm going to have to go back to like 2014. Let's see, what was the date? 6/27/14. Let's just change that to something around now. So 10/25/20, 10/26/20, 10/27/20. Okay, so if I look at the calendar view now, you're going to see, we're going to do it by due date. You're going to see a field on each of these dates. But right now it just shows that ID. So the primary key for each of those records. That's not very useful, is it? So this is a situation where I would come and change this primary key. And what I would actually do in this case is I would make the primary key a formula field. Because all it's going to show on that calendar is the primary key. So let's make that primary key something useful. That's like a high level description of what the bill is. And this is actually going to be pretty much that formula that I outlined earlier that we used as like the label field. So I'm going to concatenate, that wasn't on the webinar. That was when I was practicing ahead of time. So I'm going to concatenate. So that's just basically joining text together, just exact same as the formula in Excel. I'm going to use, let's see, vendor. I'm going to put a space in between, and then I'm going to use amount. So now the key is just that. And so if I go back and look at the calendar, each of these items is going to look like the vendor name and then the amount. And that's much more useful, right? Now you can click to open this. Let's create a public view here. You can select whether or not you want them to open it and see all of the other fields. So be mindful of that, but you can also change, do you want to look at a month at a time, 2 weeks at a time, that sort of thing. Let's see what that looks like. So this is something that doesn't exist in any other bill pay tools. To be able to see something in a view like this, a wild thing here is you can create this, and then you can even sync this to an external calendar. So they could create a shared bills calendar on their Outlook domain or something like that. You put this little snippet of code into that calendar, and it's going to sync everything in this Airtable calendar to that shared Outlook or G Suite calendar. So yeah, payroll calendars, absolutely. This is how I manage, time off for my team. It syncs to an Outlook calendar so that people don't have to go out and fuss with Airtable or save a link somewhere. It just shows up in their Outlook where they already live. So that's pretty wildly powerful. 2 more views. Gallery view. This is kind of like a card view, and it'll actually show file attachments here. There are situations where this is helpful, and you can customize the cards to show things that you want it to show, things you don't want it to show. And then lastly, Kanban. You're going to be familiar with this. I guess there aren't really any great fields with which to set this up, but this is the view where you've got like columns, and you can pull them back and forth between columns. So that's Trello. So this Airtable is a lot of things rolled up into a single tool, right? And same rules apply here. You can share views externally. So this could be an onboarding checklist with your clients, could be, a lot of different things. You've got all that external sharing power there. So that is it for kind of the basic functionality of Airtable. Why don't we take like 7 minutes and maybe throw together a different base that's a little more abstract. Sandy, what are you doing to me? Ask client base. Yeah, well, everybody's headed in the same direction here, I see. Okay, so start from scratch. So this is going to feel familiar. So this is like client request framework. We've already been down this road, but I know people are pumped about the notion of this. So how would we set this up? So let's start with requests, and let's have a secondary table that is clients. So in this clients table, let's have their name, maybe their preferred contact. It's a single select. This could be email, SMS, or carrier pigeon. Now, what this points to, you'd have to store somewhere else. What is that email address, or what is that address, whatever it is. We can gloss over that, though. We'll say Jim, Jane, and Pat. So this is your clients table. And so then obviously one of your fields in your requests table, you're going to want to point to your clients table. So each request is associated with a client, obviously. Let's keep this simple. Let's just say question. What is the question? This is going to be single line text. And then how do we want to handle the response? Who gets notified? maybe we just put an email address in here. And whenever somebody responds, whoever is identified here is going to get emailed a copy of that response. Now, this more realistically would probably be a reference to like your staff table. And then there'd be a lookup field here for their email. So, but maybe you pick Tina, your staff member, and it's going to get emailed to her or something like that. Now, you could manually enter questions in here. Let's say, please provide your McDonald's W-2. And this is, I don't remember my client's names, Jane. And we want this to go to tim@mydomain.com when we get it back. And maybe we're also going to give them the option to upload a file. Whether it's a good idea to upload a W-2 that has a social on it to Airtable is a discussion for another time. If I were actually setting something up like this, I would use a form builder that let me do like a share file integration, so they could upload it to the share file portal they already have or something like that. And so it would be all in one kind of seamless flow, but it would still capture those documents securely. So here are all the questions. And then, maybe every day, there's another process that runs through and emails or texts or whatever each of those questions, all of the outstanding requests for each client to that person. So we're getting ahead a little bit, but Airtable actually has this functionality now. Airtable released automations, which is like basic Zapier baked into Airtable. I don't know if we should go down that road yet or not. But basically, if you had to manage all of your outstanding requests in a single place, you would use a table like this. I don't think you would actually have people enter it in the table. I think what you would do is you would build a form for your staff. And this would be, client requests. Enter the question you have for the client below. So question is going to be mandatory. They're going to have to indicate a client, and then you can actually change these labels to be whatever you want them to be. So let's change this to who should be notified of the response. And then they put an email address in here. So then you could share this link with your team. So then you could share this link with your team, and your team could pile questions into here whenever they came up. Now, this is going to involve another tool sending those things out via email. Actually, Airtable can do it, but we won't dig into that right now. And then something else that will be capturing the responses. So what you're going to have here is probably another table that is the responses that the clients provide back, and each of those responses will be associated with one or several requests. I think this is coming up because of the client request framework stuff that I've kind of put out there, and this is a super basic version of that. We're going to have to carve out like a dedicated time or even a series to how to build that out, because it's obviously not a 5-minute thing. But I know that's the most upvoted thing in the workshop space. If you're still into that idea and you haven't upvoted it yet, in the community, go to workshops, and there's that board of all the workshop ideas. Upvote that, because I know people are excited about that concept and the right way to build it out. And we're going to have to circle back to that at some point. So this was like as much as I guess I could show you in 5 minutes, but it's kind of an idea of how you would structure those requests. The client's going to be its own table. The requests themselves are going to be their own table, and then the responses would be their own table. Okay, so I'm going to give you kind of a teaser of more of the power user stuff. There is a lot to Airtable, and not the kind of thing that we're going to get through in 1 hour. So we've got the other 1 hour we're going to spend on this in week 7. Honestly, we'll probably just do more Airtable workshops after the 8 weeks. Like there's so many things we can do with Airtable. Like I think it just makes sense to keep spending time in Airtable. We'll see how everybody's feeling at the end of the 8 weeks, where they want to continue working on things. But I suspect Airtable is going to be high on that list. Okay, ways to use Airtable. So if you think about Airtable as a tool, there's different ways to think about it. There's pulling a bunch of users into Airtable and people doing things inside of Airtable, or there's just like having a single Airtable service account and creating tools that people interface with externally. So an example of that is when we were looking at bills, we created all these views that were handy to share with our client. And there's different ways they could do things. You could even build an approval workflow in here pretty easily where they approve it via a form or maybe even via the gallery view. So this is filtered to only show things that haven't been approved yet. And you could achieve all of that with public facing views so that that client doesn't even have access to Airtable itself. So there's a couple different ways of kind of managing this. One is Airtable being kind of that glue behind the scenes, and you have a, maybe even just one account that's gluing all those things together, and then externally people just rely on those public views. Or you can still pull your clients into bases as collaborators. So you could share your entire workspace with somebody, probably your team, but you can also invite specific external collaborators to specific bases. So you can share it here. I do that very, very rarely. But if we look at Airtable's pricing, Airtable is not a cheap tool. So if you want access to any of the apps, which we're going to talk about in a bit here, that are pretty powerful, you're in the Pro tier. And I'm going to toggle this to monthly. So you're looking at $24 a month per user if you're into the Pro tier. So if you've got a good sized team, that gets relatively expensive pretty quick. I mean, it depends how you frame it. Like for me, Airtable is a replacement for like a whole bunch of dedicated HR tools and all these different things that are just quick to scrap together inside of Airtable. The other thing to be thinking about, the reason I know all of you guys is like leverage is everything to me. If I learn something, I'm going to share it because that's the most valuable way for me to leverage the thing that I know. And so as you're learning these things, think about, are there ways to leverage what you're learning right now with your clients? There probably are. One nice thing Airtable does with its referral program is anybody that signs up with your referral link, that gets you, I think it's a $10 credit, even for free accounts. So for example, I could go run a webinar for my client base and probably get 50 people to come who have kind of a cursory, they've heard of Airtable, maybe they just want to learn more, or maybe we just convince them it's worth attending. You could probably bankroll your Airtable subscription if you did a couple of these workshops a month. So that's something to be thinking about too, is they have actually a very generous referral program where you get credits even if the people you refer don't set up paid accounts. So I bring that up to say, there's several different ways to use Airtable. If it's kind of a background service account, that's pretty cheap because maybe you're even only relying on one account to use stuff. But the more you pull in people as collaborators, the more expensive it gets. And yeah, it'll charge you for each collaborator. Advanced Airtabling. This is pretty cool. So Airtable has what they call the Airtable universe. And this is like a playground where anybody can publish templates they use. And it's a great way to kind of get ideas going on all sorts of subjects, from like, content. Like if you do like a newsletter on a recurring basis, like a format for each of the items that go into that newsletter, kind of progressing from draft phases to like the actual deliverable, CMSs, everything you can imagine, because Airtable is at its core, it's just a database. So you can plug anything into there. So Airtable universe is interesting to explore to kind of get ideas and see the different ways that people are using Airtable. Apps are wildly powerful, but you have to be on the Pro plan for apps. So this right here, I think it was Sandy that asked, how am I doing this to-do list? This is an app. So I installed an app, and what was that one even called? So there are third-party apps available now. So like that Miro board, we can embed that sucker right on the right-hand side of Airtable if we wanted to. I'm going to look at all the apps by Airtable. And I think this one that I put right here is description. And so it's a way to just kind of like jot. Yeah, there you go. It's just a way to like kind of jot down notes. But really, really powerful things you can do with apps. So charting, you can have little cards on the right-hand side that are charts that are driven live by the data inside of the table. So you can imagine that's going to be useful, even for stuff like managing bills. Pivot table, CSV import, org chart. There's a dedupe one. So if you pull in a big set of data, it will identify duplicate bits of data and step you through each one to say, should this be removed or should they be merged? Flow charts. This can get out of control, but a really powerful one now that is not no code, but is significant is they have a code block. And so the code block can be any custom JavaScript to do whatever you want. And that may not be something that's for you, though they make it pretty easy because there's a ton of examples. It means you could set something up in here. And if you wanted a really complex set of actions to happen, you could pull in a developer, you could pull in somebody with a little more technical expertise, and that makes your Airtable that much more kind of flexible and powerful. Okay, last thing I'm going to show you is automations. We will circle back around to some of the more complex stuff in week 7, but automations is like Zapier kind of built inside of your Airtable. So first, you're going to choose a trigger, and then after that, you're going to have a set of actions. So let's create a trigger for when a record is created. Maybe this is every time a client, a staff person submits a client request or something like that, and there's a new record there. We're in the bill table now. So let's say every time a bill is added, we're going to set off this. So let's run a test to ensure this works. Test ran successfully. I'm going to simplify this view here. Now we can add any number of actions, and the actions right now are somewhat limited, but I imagine they'll build on it over time, but there's already quite a bit here. So you could send an email, you could update a record, you could run a script. So that would be like running a code block. You could send a message in Slack. Quite a bit you can do here. So you can manage your Twitter out of here. So for example, if everything had to go through an approval workflow, you could send out an email to, here you're going to pull in a field from the record that triggered this. I don't think we have anything for like a person in here, but if you had an email field in here, you would pull that in here, and then you could make a boilerplate subject like new bill ready for approval. And then anything that you want that's in this base, you can pull into the message or attach. So you can even attach an image of the bill itself to that email. And then every time a bill is added, it's going to fire off that email. Now this can be done via Airtable's built-in emailing system, or you can even integrate it with a third-party email system like your G Suite account, and it'll look like it, came from you or whoever you want that to come from. So you can set up any number of these automations. For example, if you have a time off request base, if there's a staff-facing form, every time they submit a new request, you could have it send you an email, say there's a new request pending, and then like send a link to the request or something like that. Or every time you approve something, it can notify the requester that it was approved or denied. Lots of use cases for that. So the hardest part is always taking a problem and making it explicit inside of Airtable. That's always the hard part. Airtable is fairly cut and dry. The hard problem is connecting those two issues. And that's definitely learned. That's something that coming out of the gate seems pretty abstract, but the more that you do it, the easier that will get. Now, in the community, we're going to have a recap space for this. What is this, week 2? I'm going to post this in the next 10 or 15 minutes. In that recap space, there's going to be a few kind of resources for additional kind of exploring discovery stuff if you want to see it. It'll have references to a few cool things that I've built in Airtable that I think are kind of like really cool reflections of what's possible in Airtable. Have a link to a dedicated kind of training resource for Airtable that I like if you want to explore Airtable more before we get to week 7. But head over to that recap space, in 15 minutes time or whenever you get to it for kind of some bonus materials if you want to go deeper on Airtable, because it well and truly is something that has a ton of flexibility. So next week we're talking API connectors. So for most people that means Zapier. We're going to learn 2 different API connectors. Reality is there are new API connectors coming out every day, and they connect in different ways to different tools. And it's hard to ever just live in one API connector. So we're going to learn 2 of them, see the differences, see where one may make sense and the other doesn't. But we're going to be using these API connectors and connecting it back to Airtable. So we're going to be building on what we've learned this week with Airtable. And the client request thing is a great example. That's something that I wouldn't just build inside of Airtable, but Airtable is the database that backs that whole thing. So how would we trigger emails to the clients where you batch all of those questions for each client? How would you handle responses? That's something that's going to be managed by a third-party tool, and then Airtable is kind of the back end of that. So you'll have 2 accounts to set up, and I'm going to post a topic in the space to get you everything that you need for getting set up for week 3. How cool is that? I love Airtable. Use it every single day. It's kind of becoming one of those like core apps once you realize the importance of having control over your own data. So this was week 2 in an 8-week series that I did. I'm releasing these week over week so that you can get better continuing education. Hit that subscribe button below to make sure you get each week, and check out my weekly newsletter where I drop goodies like this and more.